Welcome to Becoming Untriggered, a podcast brought to you by psychodynamic coaches and parents of three, Lavinia Brown and Andrew Lynn.
Together we normalise and unpack common challenges faced by couples and parents, explore how these could be symptoms of unprocessed trauma, and support you with the tried and tested tools for you to show up as the mum or dad, partner, and person you deserve to be. Welcome to Becoming Untriggered podcast. Today we're looking at tween rites of passage. How we can protect our kids without that protection being overlaid by our own fears and triggers from the past. And when that protection looks more like coercion.
Yeah, this is super relevant for us because we've got kids that are aged between 12 and 15 right now. Mixture of boys and girls. So they're all coming back from school and from their friends group with different stories, and we're seeing what they're being exposed to now, which is things like fighting, and there's drugs, and there's sex, and there's alcohol, and there's a lot of questions around it. There's a lot of fear around it from our kids' point of view, but also it can bring up a lot of stuff in you, in us.
Definitely. And I feel I have to get involved because they're not happy about it. They're scared about it. Yes, of course, there's the bravado on the outside of, I want to do this. I want to get drunk. I want to try drugs. I want to do all of this. But actually, when it comes to it and other people are doing it and they're seeing this on their social media feeds, they're actually quite scared about it and they don't know how to approach it and they want our guidance. So it's that weird thing of teen needing us, but not wanting us. So then our role is, well, how do you step into that vacuum and make sure that you are not coercing them into doing something that we feel they shouldn't be doing at that age? And how much is that to do with us having done it, actually, at that age and regretting it perhaps, or having done it in a way that we wouldn't recommend? How do you instill a value that's important to you as a person and a family without it coming across in some way authoritarian?
It's very difficult. And that's why I think this is such an interesting subject. Where does a desire to help or control come from? Is it the nurture that you experienced or the childhood experience that you had? So are you just repeating the rules with which you experienced as a child, which quite a lot of people do? Are you reacting from a point of being triggered from a maybe negative experience that you had with your parents? Are you reacting from a point of trauma? So I had a really bad experience with alcohol when I was 15, or drugs or sex, and therefore I don't want you to experience this. Well, actually, they might have a positive experience with all these things.
Yeah, and before we dive into more practical examples, I think the bottom line is you need to clear your past in order to show up as the parent that you want to be. It's that simple. It's always the same thing. I don't know whether this is cultural. We obviously lived in Spain, and I mistakenly actually thought that in Spain, being a Catholic country, things like that would come later, and that because of the weather, kids would be more outside. They wouldn't be stuck in their rooms on PlayStations or phones, and that the whole growing up process would be somewhat delayed. Completely wrong. I think teenagers are teenagers wherever you live. So coming back here hasn't been so much a culture shock in terms of what people are doing, although I do think alcohol's much more of a thing in England than it is in Europe, perhaps because you're exposed to it at younger age. I was introduced to alcohol very young, maybe 10, maybe younger actually. I remember being, I think, 8 or 9 and being allowed to have a shandy for Sunday lunch. Me and my brother, so he would be 2 years younger than me, we were out to have a shandy, which is a third beer and 2/3 lemonade. Did that put me off using alcohol as my coping mechanism in my 20s? No. So making it a normal part of family life did not actually stop me then going to drink in excess when I was a teenager. In France, children are given a little bit of wine when they're very, very young. And yet French people don't all Spanish people don't generally drink to excess. It's just not a thing. You and I have seen so many groups of teenagers going out for dinner and no one's drinking. We were both shocked because of our past. Alcohol was something that you did behind adults' backs and you used it to have an experience that perhaps you weren't allowed to have. You wanted to experience being out of control. So back to the kids, I'm in two minds. I've always said, oh, we're having a celebration. If you want to try my champagne, you can. And they're always, it's disgusting. Is that a good thing? Is that a bad thing? I don't know, because two of our children have said, oh, I want to get drunk. I want to try what it's like to get drunk. And that's not because I haven't introduced them to alcohol and shown them that it's not actually something that gets you drunk unless you're drinking in excess. It's because they've seen video clips of their peers being out of control and having a, inverted commas, hilarious time and doing things that are silly that they wouldn't normally do. And I don't really get why Spanish and French kids don't do that.
Well, I think it's complicated, but I do have a theory. The idea of introducing alcohol early is to normalize it and make it not a big thing.
Yeah.
But you and I both had alcoholism in the family. So we were introduced to alcohol by alcoholics, right? It's not a great example. And therefore, when we required a crutch or a coping mechanism as we got older, we'd already seen one in place. So if you're introduced to something and then shown how to use it responsibly, then I think that's a good thing. But we were introduced something and shown how to use it as a coping mechanism.
But we're not alcoholic, I would like to say. Maybe I had alcoholic tendencies in my 20s.
I probably was in my 20s, yeah.
But I don't think we role modeled that. I'm not a Buddha. I'm not the Dalai Lama. I need things sometimes to numb out, and there's nothing wrong with that. So are you passing those tools on? Yeah, you
Probably.
are. Yeah, it's learned behavior.
But I also think it's natural for every kid. When you're 13, 14, 15, there are certain things you can do when you're 17 and 18 that you desire. You want to drive. You want to have sex, you want to be an adult, you want to drink, you want to do all these things. So there's nothing wrong with trying them.
So is that it? Is it the fact that it's illegal, which is obviously tempting to a child whose brain is going through so many changes that they need to differentiate themselves not only from their parents, but from society? How do we support our children through these rites of passage in a nurturing way, in an objective way, without our stuff getting confused with our guidance?
Well, I think talking about it now, I think with alcohol, there is a potential roadmap to do it, which is introduce them to something like alcohol in a safe place, model how to use alcohol responsibly, understand that they're going to try alcohol and maybe get drunk at a party. Try not to traumatize them so they don't need a coping mechanism or crutch to pick up.
Yeah, that all makes sense. But I think it's more about this desire to be out of control. What I said earlier, that they need to differentiate themselves. They need to break rules. It's whatever they can get their hands on, they will do to the extreme just because it's there. So obviously we're going to step in there because we did the same and say, these are the dangers of taking something to an extreme. You don't have to do it this way. But in a way, it's going to fall on deaf ears because that's what they're kind of programmed to do. So it's finding, I don't know, the safe environment for them to take it to an extreme. So I don't know if I'm going to offend anyone saying this, but you and I have talked to our daughter who said, I really want to get drunk. We were, okay, well, yeah, fine. You can do it with us. And I've heard of another parent having spliff with their child because they wanted to be the one that the child had the spliff with to make sure that that first experience isn't an out of control one. But that doesn't mean really that the next time is going to be out of control. There's nothing we can do to prevent it being out of control. And in the end, they're making their own mistakes.
Yeah, I don't think you can say no and expect them not to do it. What's best? Is it best to say, no, you can't do this. This is unacceptable behavior. Then all of their friends are doing it and they're curious and they want to do it anyway. And they've got a natural desire to go against you at this point in time anyway. Or is it best to accept, okay, you may want to try some of these things. Why don't we do it together? Why don't we do it in a safe environment? Like you said, I don't even know whether that's going to scratch the itch for the teenager anyway. Because, well, this is a bit boring. This is a bit safe.
Yeah.
I need something to push back on. I need something to rebel. I need something that's mine.
And that's where, for me, drugs is such a massive trigger in terms of fear. Because I didn't do drugs. I didn't experiment because, I mean, maybe this is a preventative. We got a talk. I remember vividly this guy, and he came to talk. He was a drug addict. He came to talk to us about drug taking. And he said, you don't know when that pill's going to be your last because you don't know what's in it. So yeah, you're buying an E, you're buying LSD, you're buying whatever it is that you think you're buying. That's what you're being told is in it, but you don't know what's in it. And the only place that can be checked, and I remember logging this and going, right, I'm going to do that when I'm older, is Amsterdam. You can go to a shop in Amsterdam where they actually test the contents of what it is that you think you've bought. He obviously had some horror stories of teenage girls taking their first, and it turned out to be their last E. But then that's fear, isn't it? Fear tactics. So that worked with me, but then maybe that worked with me because that was my childhood. I was coerced into doing all sorts of things because I feared being spanked, emotional rejection. So maybe that worked with me. Maybe you have to try different things based on who you think that child is. Because that's another thing. Whilst they're all teenagers and they all want to push back, they're all going to have their own character traits. So what's going to work with each child?
I think maybe the education point is a good one. We went to a talk last week at the school that talked about cannabis' effect on the teenage brain, etc., etc. I mean, for me, I think all of that information was there as a child, and I just decided that I was going to do everything anyway.
But you also had two parents that smoked. So I'm just talking about smoking now. I've gone from drugs to smoking. In a way, they normalised that as okay. And no child is going to listen to, in 40 years' time, this might happen. But that's why I think the drugs worked on me. This experimentation today could kill you. It was immediate enough for me to listen. Whereas any kid being told that in 40 years you might get lung cancer, well, okay, I'll take my chances.
Well, I was probably addicted to nicotine before I even got into my teenage years.
Yeah.
Just from passive smoking. So that's another thing. I probably started my journey with addictive substances before I was even conscious, before I even got to that point. So that probably had an impact.
Yeah, definitely. I was absolutely shocked to hear that 14-year-olds, 15-year-olds, apparently, they're taking coke. But I know that I'm shocked because I think I never did it. Alcohol, yes. Bottom line is I don't want them to do it. But how do you make sure that they have a strong enough backbone, moral or emotional, to stand up to their peers when that peer pressure is intense and your children aren't you? They don't have the same personalities as you. So I'm worried about them doing it because I never did. So I feel I can't really talk about the effects because I don't know, whereas alcohol I can. And am I limiting their experience of what it is to be a teenager? Should I be allowing them to go out of control in a way, whatever that way is that they choose, because that is a rite of passage and that's how you become a sensible, inverted commas, adult?
These rites of passage, they've been relevant throughout time. And there are different ways to have a rite of passage as a teenager. The drugs and the alcohol and the phones and the sex is only relevant now because that's what's available in our society. So you are able to have a rite of passage without risking your health with drugs. There's two things. Number one, you've got to create somebody who loves themselves enough and is confident enough to have a sense of self. So I don't need to do something someone else wants me to do to be liked or loved. But that's the first thing, the strength of character, the thing that you said you have. And then you can educate them.
I had it with certain things.
Yeah.
Not when it came to boys.
Yeah.
Sex, I'm not proud of how I did not respect my boundaries in a way that I would like to role model. And yet I've had many conversations with our two daughters about this. And even shared my own experience. One daughter found that really helpful. One was, ew, don't tell me stuff. I don't even know that you did that. Ugh. So again, the way they interpret that is always going to be based on who they are. But I would like to think that being a feminist, being a good role model in terms of a strong woman who stands up for what I believe in, and I do that to the point that they're embarrassed, would have gone in. But one of my daughters went, yeah, that all makes sense. I really get it. And I'm probably going to do the same as you did anyway. Hold on. We've just had a 10-minute conversation about respecting yourself. I know, but okay.
It's really
cool.
tough.
I'll just deal with the fallout, because there'll be a fallout.
All we can do is do our best. We have experience. We've made mistakes. We can educate the children about that, and they're either going to take it or they're going to leave it. You can't shut the kids in their room, as much as I'd like to with our girls for the next 10 years. You can't lock them down. I mean, we know the root of that particular daughter's desire to maybe do things earlier than she should do.
But it's not earlier than others are doing it. I want to bring that up, actually, what you just said. I'd like to lock our children behind closed doors. I think there's that sexism that comes in very subtly and perhaps unconsciously about, oh yeah, especially boys, and maybe drinking to a certain degree, maybe truancy to a certain degree. Oh, boys will be boys. I've heard that in toddler groups. I am not denying that boys and girls are different. 100%. We talked about this in the last episode. Boys and girls are different biologically. They will have different approaches to life, regardless of how you treat them equally or not. And it's not okay for bad behavior, inverted commas, to be more acceptable in one sex than the other.
Well, I think number one, it's because I'm a man. So I look at our son differently.
So tell me about sex and our son and your past experiences.
I definitely was exposed to sex in all the wrong ways. So through pornography, I never had somebody talk to me about sex, talk to me about love, talk to me about relationships. So I'm very conscious of introducing my son to these concepts from my point of view or my experience. So having somebody for him to learn from, which I've started doing, even though he's not interested in talking to me about it right now. I also, when I started engaging with sex and females, I also made many, many mistakes. Mistakes in my view on what sex was, my view on my role with sex. Like I said, I got exposure to sex through pornography. Pornography is actors performing the act of sex. I picked up unconsciously that sex was a performance and one that I was not equipped to perform at the age of 15.
But going back to locking your girls up, do you think you were taught to disrespect women because of pornography? Or I think the fact that you want to lock the girls up, obviously we're talking metaphorically, is because your trigger here, because we're always bringing it back to triggers, is that perhaps you weren't great towards women. You didn't perhaps respect them in the way that you do now, and therefore you don't want to expose the girls to that kind of disrespect, which you're perhaps projecting onto the boys of her age.
Yeah, I definitely think that's true. And I think also I do view sex or relationships as men pursue women. So men are the aggressors. So it's more about teaching the girls that they can say no and teaching the girls respect for themselves and to have boundaries.
Yeah, that's what I've done. And yet I'm honestly quite shocked that the same behavior is going on in schools today than it was when I was 15. I mean, I'm 49. What was that? 30 years ago. More than 30 years ago. The boys are going, oh, do you want to come around behind the bush and do this? Or I want you to perform this on me. Really? I don't get it. The past 35 years have been, or at least the past 10 for sure, because that's when I was parenting, the past 10, 15 have been about trying to bring up boys in a different way to the way that they were brought up. To respect women. They've got sisters, to respect their mothers, to be knowledgeable about periods and how they were conceived and love and all of this business and the dangers, inverted commas, of pornography. And yet, what do I hear going on at school? The same behavior. Why?
I guess that's why I talk about locking the children up. And I would do it with our son to a certain extent as well. I would advise all of our children not to engage in sexual activity until they're mature enough to deal with it. And that's the point.
And want to do it from a place of love.
But I don't know whether that's possible. I think there are sexual desires. There's this whole thing about different things created and mature earlier than other things in the body. And I think with boys, there is this rush of testosterone. Like our son, he wants to fight me all the time. But he's obviously too young to engage in fighting. So he fights his dad. He fights me. And there are also soon going to be sexual urges that he's going to get at 13 or 14. And he's too young to engage in a mature sexual relationship.
So you're saying basically there are urges which a teenager can't necessarily override with their prefrontal cortex. They can't think about the logic, the reasoning, the consequences of their actions, which then brings me back to the secure environment in which a certain behavior is introduced, be that alcohol, drugs, sex, whatever it is. I mean, I've read many books by the author Isabel Allende. She's South American. And in many of the books, the boys, when they come to puberty, are taken either to a prostitute to lose their virginity, or they are initiated by a family friend, an older woman. And I think to English people, that's quite shocking. But then when you read it and you think about it, and I know this happened in the 18th century, you were taken to a whorehouse and you were initiated, but you were initiated into lovemaking. This older woman would show you what women like, what a woman's body is like, how to be in touch with these urges in a way that isn't primordial and bestial. So actually, whilst it's shocking, maybe that is the way to do it. And it's just that English people are so uptight and repressed when it comes to talking about sex that we've got that wrong. Whereas you look at Amsterdam and Denmark and Nordic countries, apparently they're all having sex, 13, even 14, but in a more responsible way, perhaps because they are introduced to it in a way that is more loving. I don't know.
Yeah, maybe you're right. Certainly a Western culture thing. Let's not talk about it, but you've got access to millions of videos on the internet that you can go and learn from. And that's where the people learn about intimacy and love and sex.
So preventative measures, we want to try and role model, obviously, role model loving relationships between you and I. That's going to show them that men and women can respect each other. Our needs are mutually important. You want to obviously limit pornography, but it's probably going to go on at schools. And I don't know, I think it's up to every parent to discuss whether it's right to introduce something early or not, and to think about the reasons why they might be doing that. Is that based on your bad experience that you are trying to stop your children from having? Is it based on trauma? And in the end, I think for me, the best thing we can do as parents is be able to deal with the fallout, whatever that is. And then there may not be fallout, but to deal with how they feel after they've done something, be that hopefully not stealing or being true, but it might be. It could be sex too early, an experience that they weren't ready for. It could be drugs. Being able to make space for whatever feelings it brings up in them and maybe counsel them, maybe just listen to them without judgment, which can be hard. So just always making sure that even after the event, your stuff isn't getting in the way. How do you deal with your stuff? You know that your stuff is there because you've got a disproportionate reaction to whatever it is. Shame, fear, anger, sadness, whatever emotion that is, it's going to be disproportionate. So making sure that you clear all of that so that you can hold space for that tween, experimenting teenager during and after the event.
Completely agree. I also think that the most important work is done before they get to this stage in creating the character that they are. So do they love themselves? Are they confident in themselves as human beings? And that's done through giving them the love, the attention, the affection, the nourishment, the safety in the early years. In order for you to do that, you need to be present and have processed all your own stuff. So that's the first thing, the character of the teenager that you're creating. And I think for me, also the important thing, like you said, is to take my stuff out of it and recognize that they are individual people on their own journeys. They're maybe going to make mistakes. You can educate them as much as possible. You can give them boundaries in order for them to experience that path safely.
Definitely. And I want to finish off on a point which I think is so important. People don't often realize. Trauma isn't always about what was done to you or what you experienced. It's about how that experience was handled, i.e., were you able to talk to someone about it? Were you able to process the feelings, whatever they were, that came up as a result of what happened? If you're the parent and your child does whatever it is that they're going to do, and it probably is going to involve something silly at some point, judgment is never helpful, and definitely not in the moment. You might want to have a word with, what's right and what's wrong and what the family values are at some point afterwards. But judging and shaming, what I experienced, is never helpful, because that just makes them repress whatever is there in them. And then that will become a traumatic experience because it's got lodged in your body. So I think maybe my final wrap up is, teenagers, tweens, they need to differentiate themselves from you. They need to find their sense of identity outside of parental guidance. We don't fully know our children. We know who they are at home. This touches on what we were talking about last time with in-laws. You only get a certain side of your child. I know that sometimes we've had play dates and I'm like, God, I didn't know my daughter was like that, because I've never seen her interacting in that way with me. That's who she is with her peers. That fallout might be really messy in a way that might be quite shocking, but you want to hold in any kind of judgment, find out where that judgment's come from. Is it from your past? Is it from a trigger from you? Hold space and allow them to process whatever it is that experience will bring up in them, because then it's not traumatic. Yeah, it's a little blip. It's a challenge that you're navigating as a family. It's not easy. It's not nice, but it's not going to have lasting consequences on your child if you can be that clear, open space for them to explore it on their terms.
If what we discussed was helpful, please subscribe and leave us a 5-star review. For more of the same, check out my social media, The Inner Child Healing Expert, or to work with me, go to laviniabrown.com.
You can find me on andrewlin.net or Life Coach for Dads on Instagram. We work with both individuals and couples. If there are any topics you'd like us to cover, please reach out. Thanks for listening.